So I have two sons, and if I had to choose kind of the toy that has lasted the longest and made the biggest impact on their lives, at least up till now, I would have to say that it was Lego. Lego blocks are the coolest toys. You can make basically anything you want from them, from, X-Wing fighters to whole cities to dragons and castles. They are kind of the perfect toy because they allow you to sort of create whatever you want and then play with it in any way that you desire. This video is about historical sources, and the reason I bring up Lego in the beginning of this video is to kind of make an analogy here. That historical sources, or sources, are for the historian sort of what Lego blocks are for the kid, right? They are the kind of building blocks. They are the sort of foundation for whatever you want to make. They are the beginnings of your histories. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into historical sources. We're going to look at how historians kind of designate those sources, what types of sources they talk about using, and we're going to talk a little bit about what purposes those different types of sources have for historians. Okay, let's get going. All right, let's start with what we mean by historical sources and why they are so important for historians. Okay, you might remember from a previous video that we defined history in a few ways. One of the things we said about history was that it was an empirical discipline. What we meant by that was that historians must base their histories on evidence. They can't simply rationalize the past or invent it. They have to find evidence and base their histories on that evidence. For the many things that historians try to do in their research, they find their evidence from sources. So, what are the sources that historians use? Well, historians generally classify sources into three main categories. There are primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Now, these are terms you've probably heard before and know something about, but let's define them so that we're all on the same page. Primary sources are documents or artifacts or other items from the time and place that the historian is studying. Another way of putting this is that primary sources are documents or sources produced based on the observations or experiences with people or events. Secondary sources are items that are produced on the basis of primary sources. They are studies of the past based on the analysis of contemporary observations. Following this logic, you might have figured out that tertiary sources are studies of the past that analyze secondary sources. It's a simple schema, but this kind of works for our purposes of understanding primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So what are some of the typical manifestations of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources? Well, let's start with tertiary sources. Some common forms of tertiary sources include encyclopedias and dictionaries and websites. Tertiary sources generally give broad information about the past and don't make significant arguments or interpretations. Secondary sources tend to include things like books and academic journal articles and essays, more on what these are later, as well as other productions like conference papers or dissertations. Again, secondary sources are sources that discuss the past by way of analyzing the writing and artifacts left by observers of that past. And then finally, there are primary sources, and these can be practically anything. I mean, anything that is a remnant of the past, from diaries to letters to newspaper articles to clay pots and paintings, can be useful as a primary source. The thing to understand is that they come from the time and place being studied. They can be textual, they can be non-textual, they can be intentionally produced, unintentionally produced, whatever. Historians are often really creative with the primary sources they use and how they use them. In fact, we'll talk a lot about that in later videos. All right, now we know what primary, secondary, and tertiary sources are, but let's spend a little bit more time in this next section kind of diving more deeply into what we mean by primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, what these things look like. All right, let's look more closely at primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So to begin, let's start with primary sources, and let's start kind of with a basic definition of primary sources given by Mary Lynn Rampolla, who writes this: primary sources are materials produced by people or groups directly involved in the event or topic under consideration, either as participants or as witnesses. In other words, they're raw materials of historical research based on observation or experience, right? But primary sources can be classified with more precision and in better ways. The most basic way to think about primary sources is through the form that they exist in as we access them. Historians have to gain access to primary sources if they want to make historical arguments, and they typically access them in one of two ways. The first way is as a manuscript. This essentially means in its original form. Manuscript sources are one of a kind. They're the actual productions of the people from the past that we're studying. An example might be, a handwritten letter, right? It's one of a kind, it's an original. But we can also access primary sources in published forms. This means that the original manuscript was reproduced and made broadly available. Many primary sources show up in what we call primary source readers or document collections, books that compile primary sources on the same historical topic. In fact, if you've taken a lower level history class, you've probably used a primary source reader before. Published primary sources are not the originals, but they're still primary sources. Even if a letter written in 1754 had been typed up and transcribed and included in a document collection published in 2020, it's still a primary source. It's just a modern published version of that primary source. Okay, why does all this matter? Well, simply because historians must follow what I call Brundage's golden rule. Anthony Brundage is a historian who is a professor emeritus from Cal Poly Pomona, and in his book, Going to the Sources, he writes the following. The rule is always to use the fullest, best edited collection of any primary source available to you. Under this rule, the most nutritious source would be the unedited manuscript, or the editions of those sources in which the manuscripts are reproduced in their entirety. And from there is a descending scale along which the sources used are more and more highly processed. Okay, what does Brundage mean here? Basically, he's saying that the historian must seek to get the best possible version of the primary sources that she or he intends to use. This is Brundage's golden rule. You have to try to find the best possible version of the primary sources that you incorporate in your research. So, this begs the question, what's the best possible version of a primary source? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, the best way to think of this is as a spectrum for which food will serve as a wonderful analogy. You see, when Brundage talked about the most nutritious primary sources, what he meant was the least edited, least messed with primary sources. The manuscripts, the originals. We might think of these as organic kale, totally unadulterated and utterly nutritious. The next best thing would be a photograph of the original manuscript. If we can't have the original in our hands, right in front of us, then the next best thing would be to examine an image of the original. In our analogy, we might think of this as old-fashioned rolled oats. Yes, the oats have been harvested and pressed, but they're still just oats, right? Natural, nutritious, fantastic. Great breakfast. One more step down the line might be a full transcription of the source. This is when we move from manuscript to published sources. The best possible published source is a full, complete transcription, right? Ideally by a reputable source and published with an academic press. More on this later. This is still pretty good stuff. This is our white bread. It's fairly natural, bit of processing, but still pretty dang good. The second half of the spectrum is where we start to get less nutritious versions of primary sources. Full transcriptions that have been translated are often necessary, especially for students doing their first research projects. It's acceptable for most undergraduate students, and in this class will be totally fine, but professional historians tend not to rely on transcribed and translated primary sources because they get us a little too far from the originals. Transcribed and translated sources are kind of like Doritos. Sure, they're corn, I guess, but corn that's been rolled out and fried and seasoned with God knows what. Where we really start to get into less acceptable versions of primary sources is when we get to sources that are only available as published excerpts. This raises lots of flags. First, it's been transcribed and published, which means it's already some distance away from the original. But the process of excerpting means that editorial discretion now enters the picture. You're only getting the snapshot of the source that some editor thought was useful or worthwhile. That's quite a bit of processing, and thus we might think of this version of primary sources as something akin to an energy drink, like, Monster. I have no clue what Monster is made of. Is it water and sugar? Is it water, sugar, and other chemicals? Does it have fruit juice? Does it have battery acid in it? I have no idea. Monster is a great abyss, and we don't ask questions when we drink it. We just close our eyes and hope for the best. Finally, there are primary source transcriptions that we only find from kind of dubious sources, places like, a random website or quoted in some other book. Now we are super far from the original, and this is really a level that even undergraduate students shouldn't rely on. It's Twinkies, the most processed food that I could honestly think of. A Twinkie will outlast you and I its shelf life is infinite. It's less food and more a shell for, innovative preservatives. Twinkies are like the food equivalent of a time capsule. You could bury a Twinkie, come back in 200 years, dig up that Twinkie, and it would be exactly the same. All that said, I freaking love a Twinkie. So you get the picture. Yes, primary sources are sources that come from the time and place that we're studying. But there are primary sources, and then there are primary sources, right? We have to follow Brundage's golden rule and use primary sources that are as nutritious as we can possibly get. More on how to find those nutritious sources in a later video. Okay, let's turn to secondary sources. What do we mean by secondary sources? Well, remember that secondary sources are sources that analyze primary sources to uncover the past. And the best way to remember the main types of secondary sources is to ask yourself one simple but important question. Who's your bae? Now, before you start in with an awkward response about how much your current romantic partner means to you, let me assure you that bae in this context is an acronym. It stands for books, articles, and essays. These are the three main forms of secondary sources that professional historians use. Bae is both a simple and somewhat complicated concept, and it really makes sense only if you understand one other concept first: academic legitimacy. You see, historians only rely on secondary sources that are academic secondary sources. They only read and use secondary sources produced by other professional academic historians. Why? Because these sources have gone through a process called peer review. Peer review is a process whereby multiple scholars read a piece before it's published and attest the reliability and credibility of the work. Peer review is important because it hypothetically allows experts to catch mistakes before they're incorporated into publications and assure that the publication meets professional standards like citation standards and evidentiary standards. In other words, peer review is the academic version of quality control. It means that a book is worthwhile and follows the norms of the historical profession. But now the question is, how do you tell if something has gone through peer review? Well, the easiest way to tell is if it was published by an academic press, aka a university press. As a rule, all university presses do peer review. Full stop. There are other presses that also do peer review, presses like Routledge and Brill and Ashgate and others. To find out if a press does peer review, just go to their website. Check it out. If they do, they'll tell you. It's really as simple as that. But the most important thing is that with secondary sources, we want books, articles, and essays that have gone through peer review. That's what professional historians use. Okay, lest we just stop there and call it a day, let's take a short amount of time to go through what we mean by books, articles, and essays. First, what is a book? Well, it seems like a pretty dumb question, right? The answer is obvious. We all know what a book is, right? Wrong. There are books, and then there are books. Not all books are alike. When I ask, who's your bae, and you say books, what you really mean are academic monographs. Now, what's an academic monograph? Well, it's a book written generally by one person. Get it? Monograph. But more importantly, it's a book with an argument. In other words, it's not a textbook that just presents information without any sort of overarching thesis. It's also not a novel, aka a work of fiction. And quick public service announcement. Do not use the word novel to describe a book that is a work of history. It's not a novel. A novel is fiction. A novel is purposeful make-believe. An academic monograph is an argument-driven piece of nonfiction. And we're particularly interested in monographs written by historians because, well, they're the ones that write history. And of course, we have to make sure that it is a book that has gone through peer review. This is what we mean by books, right? Professional historians generally rely on academic monographs when they do their research. Books, check. Okay, what about articles? What is an article? Well, an article is a short, argument-driven essay published in an academic journal. It's generally about 20 to 40 pages in length, and it's usually written by an academic historian. But what is an academic journal? Well, academic journals are serial productions with new articles written by different people in each issue. And when I say serial production, I don't mean this or this, but this. Serial means regularly occurring, so it's a publication that comes out regularly, usually 1, 2, or 4 times a year. Academic journals are generally published by university presses, so they are, as you guessed it, peer-reviewed. Okay, finally, what is an essay? Well, an essay is almost exactly the same as an article. It's about the same size, it's argument-driven, it generally goes through peer review. The only difference is that an essay is an article-length piece published in an edited volume, aka a book, rather than an academic journal. Well, what's the difference? Well, journals are serial productions. Books are not. Essays show up in books that are published once and only once. And they're academically legit only if the books they are included in are academically legit. In other words, if the books are published with university presses or presses that do peer review. Okay, that's the landscape of secondary sources. Books, articles, and essays. Those are the most typical forms of secondary sources that historians use. But what about tertiary sources? Well, the first thing to note is that tertiary sources generally take two forms. First, you can find them in print. Examples of print tertiary sources include encyclopedias, dictionaries, indexes, textbooks. Really anything that you can think of as like a sort of reference item is generally a print tertiary source. But tertiary sources also show up in electronic forms. These are a bit more complicated. Yes, they can be kind of electronic forms of all of the things that I just mentioned. But another form of electronic tertiary source is a website. Now, websites are kind of confusing. We'll have a whole lesson on what to do with the internet as a professional historian. People who create websites aren't generally going to archives and pulling out original documents to create their web pages. They're usually building them off of secondary or sometimes even other tertiary sources. So websites tend to be tertiary sources. Professional historians tend not to consult websites for very much. They prefer to rely on more academically legitimate sources. And that really applies to tertiary sources too. Ultimately, the best tertiary source to use is a tertiary source that's gone through peer review. In other words, kind of encyclopedias, dictionaries, and things like that have been published by university presses or that have gone through some sort of university peer review process. But in reality, you're not going to use a lot of tertiary sources. Why? Because they're the sources that are furthest from the action. Kate Turabian and the authors of A Manual for Writers said it best when they wrote, "In the early stages of research, you can use tertiary sources to get a broad overview of your topic. But if you're making a scholarly argument and you cite tertiary sources in a scholarly argument, you'll mark yourself as a novice or outsider, and many readers won't take you or your argument seriously." In other words, it's fine to use tertiary sources in the initial phases of research. That's what we'll do in this class. But eventually, professional historians opt for more solid and informational sources when they actually cite things in their papers. Phew. All right. That was a long one. Let's finish this video by talking a little bit about how historians use primary and secondary and tertiary sources. Okay, what's the point of all of this? Well, we have to know about primary, secondary, and tertiary sources and how to tell the differences between them because each have a very specific purpose in the process of historical research. Tertiary sources are meant only for the very beginning stages of research. We'll consult tertiary sources in order to get background information on our topics, and this background info will help us know who key players are, what key moments are. They'll give us kind of terms to search with when we go about searching databases and things like that. And they help us out in searching for other secondary and primary sources. Tertiary sources are often fantastic kickstarters for research. Secondary sources are multifunctional. First, they give us ideas for methodological approaches to our research. This is where we learn about what kinds of primary sources are out there on our topic, how other historians have used those sources, etc. Secondary sources also represent the historiography of our topics. If you remember from our previous video, historiography is the history of history. In the terms of historical research, it's the history of how historians have studied the topic that we're interested in. To get a sense of what the historiography is on our topic, we have to consult secondary sources. Finally, secondary sources provide historical context. Sometimes you're going to want to set the scene in order for your analysis to make sense, and secondary sources can help with that. Then finally, there's primary sources. Well, primary sources are really good for one main thing. They are the evidence for our arguments. Primary sources are our windows into the past, and we use them to get as close to the historical people and events that we're studying as we can. All right, so there it is, the world of historical sources. Hopefully by now you can kind of define and identify what primary and secondary and tertiary sources are, and you know a little bit about sort of what they look like on the ground and how historians use them. This info is going to be absolutely crucial for you as you go through the historical research process. You have to know what all of these sources are and how to deal with them when you find them. Because ultimately, the sources you choose sort of make or break the argument that you're going to make in your historical research paper. Your paper is really only as good as the sources that you base it on. So we have to understand sort of what those sources are and how to sort of obtain and judge really good ones. Don't worry, we're going to spend a lot more time on sources and how to find them and how to analyze them and what to do with them once we found them throughout the course of the semester. But this is a good start, and I hope you remember kind of the things that we went over in this video and take it forward throughout the rest of the semester. All right, that's it. See you in class.